What weapon could single-handedly destroy an entire army of 1,000 battle-hardened warriors? A sword forged by master craftsmen? A spear blessed by ancient gods? A bow that never missed its mark? None of those. The answer is so absurd, so impossible, that if it weren't written in the pages of Scripture, no one would believe it. We're talking about the jawbone of a dead donkey, a piece of rotting bone that most people would step over without a second glance. But in the hands of one man, this discarded animal bone became the most devastating weapon in ancient warfare. This is the story of Samson. Not the Hollywood version with perfect hair and bulging muscles, but the real man whose life was a collision between divine power and human weakness. Today we're diving into one of the most explosive chapters in biblical history. You'll witness a moment when heaven touched earth in the most violent and miraculous way possible. You'll see how God can take the most ordinary, even repulsive objects and transform them into instruments of His unstoppable will. This isn't just another Bible story about a strong man. This is the account of supernatural intervention that defied every law of physics and military strategy. It's about a moment when one man, empowered by the Spirit of the Almighty, became an unstoppable force of divine judgment. Get ready for a tale that will challenge everything you think you know about God's power, human limitation, and the weapons He chooses to accomplish His purposes. Because what you're about to hear actually happened, and it changed the course of an entire nation forever. The battlefield at Lehi awaits, and the impossible is about to become reality. Before we witness the carnage at Lehi, you need to understand the man behind the miracle. Samson wasn't born ordinary. His very existence was a divine intervention wrapped in human flesh. His story begins with a woman who had given up hope. For years, Manoah's wife had endured the crushing weight of barrenness in a culture where childlessness was seen as God's curse. Then one day, while she was alone, a mysterious figure appeared, not just any messenger, but the angel of the Lord Himself. "You will conceive and give birth to a son," the angel declared. But this wouldn't be just any child. No razor may be used on his head, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. The Nazirite vow meant 3 sacred restrictions: no wine or strong drink, no contact with dead bodies, and most visibly, no cutting of the hair. These weren't arbitrary rules, they were external signs of an internal consecration. Samson's uncut hair would become the visible symbol of his covenant with God and the source of his supernatural strength. When the boy was born, they named him Samson, meaning little sun, and like the sun, he would bring both light and scorching heat to his generation. The Scripture tells us that the child grew and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. But here's what made Samson unique among biblical heroes. His strength wasn't just physical. When the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, he didn't just become strong, he became supernaturally empowered beyond human comprehension. We're talking about a man who could tear apart lions with his bare hands, carry off city gates, and yes, slaughter armies with makeshift weapons. Yet Samson was also tragically human. He was impulsive, driven by passion, and often seemed more interested in personal vendettas than national deliverance. God had chosen him not because he was perfect, but because divine power works best through human weakness. This was the man standing at Lehi, consecrated from birth, empowered by heaven, but about to face his greatest test. To understand why God unleashed such devastating power through Samson, you need to grasp the suffocating reality of Israel's situation. For 40 long years, the Philistines had crushed the chosen people under their iron fist. This wasn't just political domination, it was systematic humiliation. The Philistines controlled the coastland with their 5 major cities, and from there they squeezed Israel like a python, slowly constricting its prey. They monopolized iron technology, meaning Israelites couldn't even sharpen their own farming tools without paying tribute to their oppressors. But the real tragedy wasn't economic or military, it was spiritual. Israel had abandoned the God who had delivered them from Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had brought down the walls of Jericho. They had chosen to worship the false gods of their neighbors, and now they were reaping the bitter harvest of their rebellion. The people had grown comfortable with compromise. Many Israelites, especially in Judah, had accepted Philistine rule as the new normal. They'd rather keep the peace than fight for freedom. They'd forgotten what it meant to be God's chosen people, settling instead for survival under foreign masters. This spiritual amnesia had created a generation that feared their oppressors more than they trusted their God. When trouble came, they looked to political solutions rather than divine intervention. They had become a people without hope, without vision, and without the courage to believe that things could change. Into this darkness, God raised up judges, not perfect leaders, but flawed human beings through whom he could demonstrate his power. Samson was the last and most dramatic of these deliverers, a one-man wrecking crew designed to shatter Philistine confidence and remind Israel that their God still reigned. The Philistines thought they had Israel exactly where they wanted them, subdued, compliant, and hopeless. They had no idea that God was preparing to unleash a force of nature that would turn their world upside down. The stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through history, and at the center of it all stood one man whose very existence was a declaration of war against the enemies of God's people. The path to that blood-soaked battlefield began with a wedding that should never have happened. Samson had fallen for a Philistine woman in Timnah, and despite his parents' protests, he was determined to marry her. "Get her for me," he demanded, "because she's the right one for me." What his parents didn't know, what even Samson didn't fully understand, was that God was using his questionable romantic choices to create opportunities for conflict with the Philistines. Sometimes divine providence works through our worst decisions. At the wedding feast, Samson posed a riddle to 30 Philistine companions. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. The stakes were high, 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. The Philistines had 7 days to solve it, but the riddle was impossible without inside information. The answer came from Samson's encounter with a lion on his way to Timnah. He had torn the beast apart with his bare hands, and later found that bees had made honey in its carcass. But how could the Philistines possibly know this? They couldn't unless someone told them. For 3 days the Philistines were stumped. Then they turned to Samson's bride with a threat that chilled her blood. "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us, or we will burn you and your father's household to death." Faced with death, she wept and pleaded with Samson until he finally broke down and revealed the answer. On the 7th day, just before sunset, the Philistines smugly declared, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson's response was explosive. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." He knew he'd been betrayed by the woman he loved. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him with violent force. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of their belongings, and gave their clothes to those who had explained the riddle. Then he stormed back to his father's house, burning with rage. But the story was far from over. While Samson was away, his bride was given to his best man, the ultimate insult in that culture. When Samson discovered this betrayal, his revenge was swift and devastating. He caught 300 foxes, tied them tail to tail in pairs, fastened torches to their tails, and released them into the Philistine grain fields. The fire consumed not only the standing grain, but also the vineyards and olive groves. The Philistines' response was brutal and predictable. They burned Samson's wife and her father alive. the very fate she had tried to avoid by betraying him. This pushed Samson over the edge. He attacked them viciously, slaughtering many, then retreated to a cave in the rock of Etam. The personal had become political, and the Philistines were ready for war. The Philistines weren't about to let Samson's rampage go unanswered. They mobilized their forces and marched into Judah, setting up camp and preparing for a full-scale military operation. Their message to the men of Judah was crystal clear: hand over Samson or face the consequences. This put the tribe of Judah in an impossible position. They were already living under Philistine domination, and the last thing they wanted was to provoke their oppressors further. 3,000 men of Judah, an entire army, marched to the rock of Etam, where Samson had taken refuge. When they found him, their words revealed just how deeply the spirit of defeat had penetrated God's people. "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" Think about that for a moment. Here was a man who had single-handedly struck terror into their enemies, and instead of celebrating him as a hero, they were treating him like a criminal. They had become so accustomed to slavery that freedom felt like a threat. Samson's response was measured but pointed. "I merely did to them what they did to me." He wasn't the aggressor, he was responding to their brutality. But his own people couldn't see past their fear. "We have come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines," they declared. 3,000 armed men had come to capture one of their own, not to fight alongside him, but to deliver him to their enemies. Here's what's remarkable about this moment. Samson could have resisted. He could have fought his way through all 3,000 of them. Instead, he agreed to their cowardly plan, but with one crucial condition: "Swear to me that you won't kill me yourselves." They bound him with 2 new ropes, strong, fresh cords that should have held any normal man. As they led him away from the rock of Etam toward the Philistine camp at Lehi, Samson must have looked like a defeated prisoner of war. The men of Judah probably felt relieved. They had solved their problem without bloodshed. They could return to their comfortable subjugation, and the Philistines would have their prize. But they had no idea what they were actually delivering to their enemies. They weren't handing over a captured rebel. They were delivering a weapon of mass destruction directly into the heart of the Philistine army. The march to Lehi was a funeral procession in reverse. Everyone thought they were witnessing the end of Samson's story, but they were actually walking toward the most spectacular display of divine power in the book of Judges. As the procession approached Lehi, the Philistines erupted in triumphant shouts. Their enemy was bound, helpless, and about to be delivered into their hands. After months of humiliation and devastating losses, they finally had Samson exactly where they wanted him. The war cries echoed across the valley as hundreds of Philistine warriors surged forward to claim their prize. They had probably planned elaborate tortures, public humiliation, maybe even a slow execution to send a message to anyone else who dared challenge their authority. But in that moment of apparent defeat, something extraordinary happened. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson with explosive power. This wasn't a gradual strengthening or a slow buildup of energy. It was an instantaneous transformation that defied every natural law. The same divine force that had spoken the universe into existence now flowed through the muscles and bones of one consecrated man. The ropes that bound his arms, those new, strong cords that 3,000 men had trusted to hold him, suddenly became like flax that had been burned in fire. They didn't just break, they disintegrated, falling away from his wrists as if they had never existed. The Philistines' victory shouts turned to confused murmurs, then to growing alarm as they realized their prisoner was no longer bound. But Samson wasn't looking at them yet. His eyes had found something else, something that would become the instrument of their destruction. There, lying on the ground, was the fresh jawbone of a donkey. Not an ancient dried-out bone, but one that still had moisture in it, making it dense and solid. In any other hands, it would have been nothing more than refuse. But as Samson's fingers closed around it, this piece of animal remains became a weapon more deadly than any sword ever forged. The transformation was complete. The bound prisoner had become an unstoppable force of divine judgment. The Spirit of the Lord hadn't just given him strength. It had turned him into a living manifestation of God's wrath against the enemies of his people. What happened next would be remembered for generations, whispered around campfires and recounted in the halls of kings. The Philistines had come expecting to claim a trophy, but they were about to become one instead. The jawbone felt perfectly balanced in Samson's grip, as if it had been crafted specifically for this moment. And perhaps, in the mysterious workings of divine providence, it had been. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a supernatural slaughter that redefined the impossible. Samson raised the donkey's jawbone and charged into the Philistine ranks like a force of nature unleashed. The first warrior who met him probably had time for one confused look before the bone crushed his skull. The second fell before he could even draw his sword. The third, fourth, and fifth collapsed in rapid succession as Samson moved through their lines like death itself. This wasn't normal combat. A jawbone should have shattered after the first few blows, but this one remained solid, unbreakable, as if it were made of the finest steel. Each swing found its mark with devastating precision. Helmets crumpled, shields splintered, and armor proved useless against the supernatural force driving each strike. The Philistines tried to surround him, but Samson moved with inhuman speed and agility. He spun, ducked, and struck with a rhythm that seemed almost musical in its deadly efficiency. Bodies began piling up around him as panic spread through the enemy ranks. Some warriors tried to flee, but there was nowhere to run. Samson pursued them across the battlefield, the jawbone whistling through the air as it found target after target. Others attempted to fight in formation, but their military training meant nothing against a man empowered by the Almighty. The sound was horrific, the crack of bone against bone, the screams of the dying, the desperate shouts of commanders trying to rally troops who were witnessing something beyond their comprehension. This wasn't just a man fighting. This was divine judgment being executed through human hands. As the carnage continued, something remarkable happened. Samson began to speak, his voice carrying across the battlefield even as he continued his relentless assault. "With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men." It was part battle cry, part victory song, and part prophetic declaration, each word punctuated by another fallen enemy, each syllable accompanied by the whistle of the bone through the air. The Philistines, who had come expecting easy victory, now found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Their 1,000-man force was being systematically destroyed by one man wielding what should have been a useless piece of animal refuse. When the dust finally settled and the last enemy warrior fell, Samson stood alone among the carnage, still gripping the jawbone that had become the instrument of Israel's deliverance. 1,000 Philistine soldiers lay dead around him, and not one had managed to inflict so much as a scratch on God's chosen deliverer. The impossible had become reality, and the name of the Lord had been glorified through the most unlikely weapon imaginable. Standing among the bodies of 1,000 fallen enemies, Samson lifted his voice in a victory song that would echo through the ages. His words weren't just celebration. They were a poetic declaration of what God had accomplished through the most humble of weapons. "With a donkey's jawbone I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone I have killed 1,000 men." The Hebrew wordplay was brilliant and intentional. The word for donkey and heap sounded nearly identical, so his song could also be heard as, "With a donkey's jawbone I have made heaps of them." It was both a pun and a prophecy, capturing the absurdity and the magnitude of what had just occurred. When he finished his song, Samson threw down the jawbone that had served as his instrument of destruction. The bone that had just rewritten military history was now nothing more than refuse again, its divine purpose fulfilled. But the place where this miracle occurred would never be forgotten. They called it Ramath Lehi, Jawbone Hill, a permanent memorial to the day when God turned a piece of animal bone into the most effective weapon in ancient warfare. Every time someone passed that place, they would remember that the Lord could use anything, no matter how insignificant, to accomplish his purposes. But victory came with a price that Samson hadn't anticipated. The supernatural exertion had left him desperately thirsty. The adrenaline was fading and the physical toll of the battle was setting in. This wasn't ordinary thirst. This was a consuming need that threatened his very life. After experiencing such incredible divine power, Samson now faced the humbling reality of human limitation. He cried out to the Lord with raw desperation. "You have given your servant this great victory. Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" It was a prayer that revealed both faith and frustration. Samson recognized that God had given him the victory, but he couldn't understand why deliverance would be followed by such desperate need. Would the God who had empowered him to destroy 1,000 enemies now let him die of thirst? The answer came swiftly and miraculously. God opened up a hollow place in Lehi, and water gushed forth like a spring. Samson drank deeply, and his strength returned, his spirit revived, and life flowed back into his exhausted body. They named that spring En-Hakkor, the spring of the one who called out, another permanent reminder of God's provision in the moment of greatest need. The man who had just demonstrated supernatural power had also experienced supernatural grace, and both would be remembered forever at the place called Jawbone Hill. The battlefield at Lehi teaches us truths that shatter our assumptions about how God works in this world. When the Almighty decided to deliver Israel from their oppressors, He didn't choose a gleaming sword or a mighty army. He chose a piece of rotting bone that any sensible person would have kicked aside. This reveals something profound about divine strategy. God delights in using the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, the weak things to shame the strong. The Philistines had iron weapons, military training, and numerical superiority, but all their advantages crumbled before one man wielding what appeared to be garbage. The lesson cuts deeper than military tactics. God often chooses the most unlikely instruments to accomplish His greatest works. Moses had a speech impediment, yet became the voice of liberation. David was a shepherd boy who toppled a giant. The disciples were fishermen who turned the world upside down. And here, a donkey's jawbone became the weapon that broke Philistine power. But notice this. The jawbone was powerless until it was in the right hands, empowered by the right spirit. Without Samson, it remained refuse. Without the Spirit of the Lord, even Samson was just another strong man. The miracle happened at the intersection of human availability and divine empowerment. This challenges our modern obsession with credentials, resources, and conventional wisdom. We think we need the perfect tools, the ideal circumstances, and impressive qualifications before God can use us. But Lehi declares that God is more interested in our willingness than our worthiness, more concerned with our availability than our ability. This story also reveals the cost of being God's instrument. Samson's victory was followed by desperate thirst, a reminder that divine power flowing through human vassals often comes with unexpected consequences. Those who serve as channels of God's strength must also learn to depend on His provision. Perhaps most importantly, Lehi demonstrates that no situation is too hopeless for divine intervention. Israel had accepted defeat as permanent, but God had other plans. When His people cry out in genuine desperation, he can transform the most impossible circumstances into opportunities for miraculous deliverance. The question isn't whether God has the power to change your situation. Lehi proves he does. The question is whether you're willing to be the unlikely instrument he might choose to use, and whether you'll trust him even when his methods seem as absurd as fighting an army with a piece of bone. So there you have it, the most impossible military victory in human history, accomplished with the most ridiculous weapon imaginable. One man, one jawbone, 1,000 dead enemies, and a God who specializes in turning the world's logic upside down. Samson's triumph at Lehi wasn't just about defeating the Philistines. It was a declaration that the God of Israel still reigned, still cared for his people, and still possessed unlimited power to deliver them from any oppressor. In a single afternoon, he shattered 40 years of Philistine dominance and reminded an entire generation that nothing is impossible when the Spirit of the Lord moves. But this story isn't just ancient history. It's a living reminder for anyone who feels overwhelmed by impossible odds. Maybe you're facing giants that seem unbeatable, circumstances that appear hopeless, or challenges that have left you feeling as helpless as Israel under Philistine rule. Lehi whispers a powerful truth into your situation. God hasn't changed. The same power that flowed through Samson's arms is available today. The same God who can turn a donkey's jawbone into a weapon of mass destruction can transform your weakness into his strength, your limitations into his opportunities. The question isn't whether God can handle your problems. He can obliterate them as easily as Samson destroyed that Philistine army. The real question is whether you'll trust him enough to step into the battle, even when his methods seem as crazy as fighting with animal bones. Don't let this story end here. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue exploring the most incredible accounts in biblical history. In our next video, we'll uncover another mind-blowing tale of divine intervention that will challenge everything you think you know about God's power. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that no situation is too hopeless for the God who turns jawbones into weapons of victory. And remember, when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon you, even the most ordinary moments of your life can become extraordinary displays of His glory. The battlefield at Lehi is calling. Will you answer?